Hi, welcome to our channel of IGNOU audiobooks, Indira Gandhi National Open University, School of Gender and Development Studies, SOGDS, Bachelor's Degree Programs. Bachelor of Arts, Gender Studies, BAGS. Semester 6. BPCG 176 Psychology of Gender. Block-1 An Introduction to Gender Issues. Unit-1 Introduction to Psychology of Gender. 1.0 Learning Objectives. After reading this unit, you will be able to explain how research evolved in the area of psychology of gender, elaborate upon different quantitative methods that are utilized in this area, elucidate the nature of qualitative inquiry in the field of psychology of gender. 1.0 Introduction. As a society, sex has always been considered as an important category. An infant's sex is the first thing we try to figure out about him/her, and perhaps also the first thing we notice in a child or an adult. Our names and certain kind of clothes are also indicative of sex. Why are we so keen on knowing someone's sex? Why do we need to know a person's sex to interact with them? These questions may sound simple at one level but carry a lot of significance and run much deeper than a simple binary distinction of a boy or girl and a male or female. A person's sex, or let's use the word gender, we will distinguish between the two terms ahead in the unit, has implications for our feelings, beliefs, attitudes and also our behavior towards the person. Gender has also been a subject of inquiry and scrutiny over the years due to its widespread implications in different areas. Over the years, scientists and researchers have debated regarding similarities and differences between men and women and the potential consequences due to it in different areas. For instance, are women more emotional than men? Are women more empathetic than men? Are men better at math than women? How are male friendships different from the female ones? Are men less willing to seek help for health problems than women? Are men more body positive than women? In this unit, we will try to know about the history of the psychology of gender and various kinds of methods that can be employed in such researches. But before that, let us pay attention to some of the terms which would enhance our understanding of the area and would be used throughout. Sex refers to the biological categories which are distinguished by genes, chromosomes, and hormones. It is considered to be a stable category, even across the cultures. Generally, the distinction is understood as male or female, something that is assigned at birth. Gender, on the other hand, is a more fluid concept that is socially constructed. Thus, it refers to the social categories of male and female which are distinguished by a set of psychological characteristics and roles that society assigned to each biological category or sex. Understanding of gender differs with culture, as each society has its own prescribed set of rules regarding behavior that men and women should display and follow. Thus, sex is a biological categorization based on reproductive repertoire, and gender is the social elaboration of the biological sex. Interestingly, there is another term that would better capture the societal influence on biological-based categories rather than gender, and it is gender role. Helgeson, 2020. Gender role refers to the expectations that are because of being a male or a female. It's a social position that has a prescribed set of expectations attached to it due to a particular biological category. For instance, we expect men to be strong, independent, hiding their emotions. These attributes are based on the labels of masculinity and femininity. Masculinity involves traits or behaviors that society has assigned to the male gender role, such as self-confidence, aggression, or interest in sports. Femininity includes traits or behaviors attributed to the female gender role, for instance, being emotional, helping others, interest in knitting or cooking. In 1964, Robert Stoller coined another term, gender identity. It refers to an individual's perception about their own self as psychologically male or female. For an individual whose gender identity corresponds their biological sex, they are called as cisgender individuals, but for those whose gender identity does not match their biological sex are termed as transgender individuals. For instance, a person born as a female, biologically, may feel like a male psychologically and thus may also choose to live life like a male, dressing, behavior as expected from a man from societal viewpoint. Taking a step forward, transsexuals are people who have a gender identity that does not match their biological sex, but they undergo surgical or hormonal treatment to change their sex in order to correspond with their gender identity. It is important to note here that gender identity is different from sexual identity, and one should also not confuse it with sexual orientation. Sexual orientation is about the preference of an individual to have other sex or same-sex people as partners for love and sex. Homosexuals prefer same-sex partners, heterosexuals prefer other sex partners, and bisexuals are accepting of both same-sex and other sex partners. Some people also consider themselves to be gender fluid as they do not agree with the binary concept of gender, males and females, that we have been discussing. Certain people call themselves as gender hybrids, a combination of male and female. Intersex people are those who are born with ambiguous genitalia. This unit will introduce you to the history of psychology of gender, methods and difficulties in gender research, and the importance of qualitative inquiry in gender research. 1.1 History of the psychology of gender. We know that sex and gender have been used interchangeably, but they are two different concepts. Now let us briefly look at the history of psychology of gender to understand how the area evolved over time, the issues that have been of concern, how different constructs have conceptualized, measured and were made sense of over a period of time. The following division has been taken from Helgeson's 2020 work, who has divided history of this field into 4 periods approximating those identified by Richard Ashmore, 1990. 1.1.1 1894 to 1936. Sex differences in intelligence. The first period in this area focused on the differences between men and women. Ellis, 1894, published his book Man and Woman, highlighting the need and importance of studying similarities and differences between men and women. It is also important to note that till now, gender roles were not there in the picture, and the basic goal was to examine if men were intellectually superior to women. Some critics have argued that some of the researchers were not finding out but were actually trying to establish male superiority. In order to accomplish this goal, the initial researchers involved the anatomy of human brain. They tried understanding the human brain size, and as women's heads and brains are smaller than men, it was concluded that women were intellectually inferior. But further research concluded that if we calculate the ratio of weight of the brain to the weight of the body, women's brain appeared larger than men's brain. Thus, brain size could not resolve these questions effectively. After this, scientists and researchers started investigating specific brain areas that could be responsible for intellectual functioning. Initially, frontal cortex was considered responsible for intellectual functioning, but later when it was revealed that men do not have larger frontal lobes, rather parietal lobes were larger, activities associated with thinking and functioning were shifted to parietal lobe, and it was considered as the seat of intellectual functioning. This period ended with the groundbreaking work of Sex and Personality by Terman and Miles, 1936, who concluded that sex-related differences do not exist in intelligence. 1.1.2 1936 to 1954, Masculinity-Femininity as a global personality trait. By this time, the focus of research had shifted to gender-related traits, and sex or anatomy was not considered as the sole basis. Thus, the ideas associated with labels such as masculinity, femininity were being introduced. In 1936, Terman and Miles introduced a 456-item instrument to measure these two constructs and called it Attitude Interest Analysis Survey, AIAS. While constructing the test, it was noted that the items on which an average female scored higher than an average male were labeled feminine and vice versa. But the scale also had certain issues. For instance, the information subscale in it was based on the assumption that men have greater knowledge in certain areas such as sports, politics in comparison to women who are more knowledgeable in some other areas such as sewing, gardening, etc. So, giving a correct response to an item which women supposed to know better was scored as feminine and vice versa. Later, Hathaway and McKinley, 1949, developed Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, MMPI, which included masculinity-femininity scale with items regarding emotional sensitivity, altruism, sexual preference for some occupations, and questions related to gender identity. An important point to note here is that the femininity items were validated on 13 homosexuals. Homosexual men were compared to heterosexual male soldiers, as they were considered to be the epitome of masculinity, and homosexual men were considered to be feminine. Two major issues are present here, that is, the women were not even involved and only 13 homosexual men were involved, in lieu of women, which is not sufficient to validate any instrument. Several projective tests were also developed which consisted of incomplete drawings such as the one by Frank and Rosen, 1949. Men and women were asked to complete 60 such drawings. Or stimulus and sex differences were found in the way 36 of 60 were complete. Apart from the content, differences were also noticed in how men made shaper edges, angular drawings, and focused on unifying the objects than women who would leave the stimuli open and made round or blunt edges. Interestingly, Frank and Rosen concluded that their test measures the acceptance of one's gender role, and not the degree of masculinity and femininity. This is because they found that men who got a feminine score had drawings that were different and bizarre to a woman who received a feminine score and vice versa. 1.1.3 1954 to 1982, Sex Typing and Androgyny. The Development of Sex Differences, Maccabee, 1966, reviewed various theories regarding sex typing, how young boys and girls develop sex-appropriate preferences, personality traits, and behaviors. Later, in 1973, another major critique about the existing masculinity/femininity instruments came, Constantinople, 1973. Use of sex differences as the basis to define masculinity and femininity was questioned. Another aspect being questioned was if masculinity-femininity was a unidimensional construct. Two important instruments were developed during this time that linked the instrumental versus expressive orientation to gender roles. These were BEM Sex Role Inventory, BSRI, BEM, 1974, and Personal Attributes. Questionnaire, PAQ, Spence, Helmreich, and Stapp, 1974. They were constructed with the basis that masculinity and femininity are two independent dimensions. Thus, for every individual, both a masculinity score and a femininity score are calculated. In both the instruments, different items on the masculinity scale were instrumental in orientation and the ones on the femininity scale were expressive in orientation, and scores on both were uncorrelated. It would be interesting to note here that with time, masculinity scores in women have increased. Thus it has been concluded that people have started viewing masculine characteristics more desirable in women than they used to earlier. Oster and Dome, 2000. But their view of who is a desirable man has not changed much with time. Some longitudinal studies, such as one by Jones and colleagues, 2011, concluded that men's expressive orientation score increases with age and women's agency score increases with age. With the idea of masculinity and femininity as independent dimensions, another area emerged: androgyny. An androgynous person would display both the traits, masculine and feminine. The results of tests such as BSRI and PAC are usually interpreted in the following ways: high number of masculine features and low number of feminine features, masculine. Low number of masculine features and high number of feminine. Features: feminine. High number of both masculine and feminine features, androgynous. Few masculine and feminine features, undifferentiated. Those whose sex corresponded to their gender role group were called as sex-typed, but those whose sex and gender roles did not correspond were called as cross-sex typed. Researchers have believed and demonstrated that most psychologically healthy people are those who possess both attributes, as they have greatest behavioral flexibility and best psychological adjustment. But subsequent researchers, Wu and Oe, 2006, revealed that masculinity scale predicts better behavioral flexibility and psychological adjustment than androgyny score. Perhaps that is because of the fact these traits are valued better in American and other patriarchal societies. Both BSRI and PAC were criticized for involving attributes that are socially desirable. Thus, the most recent advances in this period were focused on considering and measuring the socially undesirable aspects of gender roles. This led to two other important concepts: unmitigated agency and unmitigated communion. Spence et al., 1979. 1.1.4 1982 Present. Gender role as a social category. Research on sex and gender has flourished over the years, and three major trends have been seen then. They are as follows. Gender as a multifaceted or multidimensional construct. This view believes that a two-dimensional view of masculinity and femininity is not enough to understand gender roles in totality. Thus, it started including diverse content, such as physical characteristics, role behaviors, and personality traits, emphasizing the social context in which gender occurs. Social constructionists argued that gender doesn't reside in us, but instead it gets constructed with our interactions with people around us. So, we create gender with our expectations, behavior, and what we decide to include in this category. Shift from focus on sex of target effects to sex of perceiver effects. In understanding sex as a social category, an attempt has been made to examine the implications of this category for men and women themselves and how others treat them. Researchers have been trying to understand the influence of society's conceptualization of gender roles for both men and women. When these gender role expectations have negative consequences for people, it is called as gender role strain. It occurs when gender role expectations conflict with naturally occurring tendencies of people. For instance, a man who takes interest in cooking or knitting may suffer from gender role strain. 1.2 Methods in gender research. Various quantitative and qualitative methods have been used to explore and make sense of areas pertaining to sexuality and gender. In this section, we will try to understand some of the ways in which research can be conducted in this area. 1.2.1 The scientific method. Scientific method rests on internally consistent models which can reliably predict future observations. It rests on theories which are a collection of facts or an abstract generalization providing explanation for the set of facts. It is important to note here that for a theory to be scientific, it must be falsifiable, a possibility that the theory can be disproved. Generally, a theory, as seen in Figure 1.1, is used to generate hypothesis, proposed explanation for a phenomenon, or a prediction that an outcome can occur under a specific condition, which is tested by collecting data. The data, thus collected, may support the formulated hypothesis, hence maintaining the theory or refute it and suggesting modification in the theory. Theory to generating hypothesis to testing hypothesis to data collection to facts and repeat. Figure 1.1 Steps in research process. 1.2.2 The experimental method. An experimental study involves manipulation of one variable, while keeping all other variables constant. Thus, it tries to establish a cause and effect relationship. Through careful measurement, the variable that is being manipulated is the independent variable, 4, and its effect is being observed on another variable, which is called as the dependent variable, dV. Let us try and understand this with an example. If our research question is, does testosterone increase aggression? Then our for would be testosterone and dV would be aggression, as we would be trying to understand the impact of testosterone level on aggression. To understand the steps involved in an experimental study, see Figure 1.2. Look at the screen. Figure 1.2. 2 steps in conducting an experiment. An experimental method uses two groups, an experimental group and a control group. An experimental group is the one where the participants are exposed to the manipulation of for. It is a treatment condition. This data is compared to the data from another group which does not receive the manipulation of for, or which is not exposed to the experimental treatment and is called as the control group. Comparing the two groups gives us an opportunity to see the impact variables had on the participants. Let us take an example to understand an experimental design better. According to social role theory, differences and similarities that we observe in men and women reflect gender role beliefs that represent people's perceptions of social role of a man or woman in the society they live in. Eagley and Wood, 1999, 2011. This theory has been applied to all kinds of human behavior, for instance, nurturance. Let us try and understand if men and women are in the same social role, will they show similar levels of nurturance, that is, the difference in the nurturance could be due to social roles that are assigned to them. Thus, women seem to be more nurturant in nature, in general, due to their social role as mothers. Now, to test this using an experimental design, we can assign males and females to one of the two social roles. For instance, some men and women can be assigned to the caretaker condition and others to the non-caretaker condition, and their nurturant behavior can be observed. In the caretaker condition, the participants might be instructed to take care of and play with the puppy. In the non-caretaker condition, the participants would be asked to teach some tricks to the puppy. Hegelson, 2020. If both men and women show same high levels of nurturant behavior in the caretaker condition and similar lower levels in the non-caretaker condition, then the hypothesis that social roles lead to differences in nurturance rather than sex would be confirmed, thus supporting the social roles theory. But if we see women being more nurturant in both the conditions in comparison to men, the theory would need some revision. Now, let us dive a bit further in this example. We need to ensure here that other variables besides the caretaker instructions do not have a role to play on nurturance. There might be a possibility that participants in the caretaker condition seem more nurturant due to their love for animals or their engagement with their own pets at home in comparison to those who are a part of the non-caretaker group. In order to avoid this, we would randomly assign the participants to each condition. Random assignment would give each participant an equal chance of being assigned to each condition in the experiment. This means there is no systematic way of assigning people to conditions and thus avoiding any sort of possible bias. Random assignment could be made by flipping a coin, drawing a chit out of a bowl, using random numbers table, or using a computer to randomly generate a sequence of numbers. A true experiment is the one that is carefully planned, tightly controlled, objective, free of bias, and easy to replicate. It is difficult to achieve such a feat in social sciences, thus making it difficult to conduct true experiments at times. Box 1.1 Advantages and Disadvantages of Experimental Design. Advantages: it allows determining a cause and effect relationship between the variables. Because all the other variables except for are held constant, any difference in dV is attributed to the fourth. Provides with a high level of control. As some specific variables are isolated, it becomes possible to determine the viability of a potential outcome, thus moving towards better and accurate results. It is not limited to certain areas, fields or topics, and therefore has a wider usage. The results of an experimental study can be replicated. This also helps in promoting validity of a concept or theory. Thus, the results can be checked, rechecked and verified. It can be combined with other research methods such as qualitative ones. This provides the study with the scientific rigor that comes with the experimental method and also opens up other possibilities of determining what suits best for a specific population or research question. Disadvantages: artificiality. Experiments are conducted in non-natural or made-up conditions, such as laboratories. The artificiality of a lab along with the unnatural task that the participants are asked to perform may make generalization of the behavior difficult. Thus, experiments lack ecological validity. Lab setting makes the behavior narrow in range, especially when we control the situation to maintain precision. It may limit the behavior. One of the major issues could be of confounding variables, the ones that affect both FOR and DV, producing distorted associations. They confound the true relationship between two variables, impacting the internal validity. A major reason for this could be the social situation of the experiments in psychology or gender psychology. The participants here are not passive or inanimate objects but active, thinking beings. Experimenter effect. It is quite obvious for a participant to work out what the experimenter is expecting out of the study. Experimenter may also drop certain cues, unknowingly or deliberately, conveying the purpose of the experiment to the participants. An important issue with the experimental method may concern ethics. There are certain areas of human life which cannot be ideally studied using experimental method, as it could be unethical to do so. Types of experiments. Lab experiments conducted in a laboratory under highly controlled conditions, or in a place where accurate measurement is possible using a standardized procedure. The decision regarding the place, time and participants lies with the researcher solely. Field experiments. They are done in everyday environment of the participants or the field. The experimenter manipulates the field like lab experiments, but it has an advantage of less artificiality than a lab setting. In a field experiment, the behavior under investigation seems to occur naturally. It would be important to note here that in a real-life setting, it is difficult to control extraneous variables. Natural experiments. These are also conducted in the everyday life of the participants, but here the experimenter has no control over the field as it occurs naturally in the real life. For instance, the attachment research by Hodges and Tizards, 1989, compared the long-term development of children who were adopted, fostered, or returned to their mothers with a control group that included children who had spent their lives with their biological mothers. 1.2.3 Correlational study. It is a non-experimental research method that involves measurement of two variables to see if a relationship exists between the two, usually at a single point on time. For instance, we could draw a correlation between job characteristics and nurturant behavior. Thus, we may observe people in service sector, individuals holding people-oriented jobs, and measure their level of nurturance. The issue here would be that we cannot identify whether the trait of nurturance led to the choice of such a job or if such a job caused nurturance in the individual. Therefore, correlation studies do not study cause and effect relationships. Attempts have been made to correlate sex with job characteristics. Literature is replete with studies stating that women are found holding people-oriented jobs more than men. Here also, it would be difficult to gauge if sex led to the choice of a certain kind of job or if a third variable is responsible for the relationship that exists between the two, which could be of working hours, salary, etc. The value of correlation ranges from -1 to +1. Both -1 and +1 are called as perfect correlations. That is, one can perfectly predict one variable from the occurrence of the other. A positive correlation indicates that both the variables move in the same direction. Increase in one leads to increase in another, or decrease in one leads to decrease in other, while a negative correlation indicates that the variables move in opposite direction. With increase in one there is a decrease in another. So, a correlation reflects the strength and/or direction of the relationship between two or more variables. For the purpose of understanding, let us take the examples used above. A perfect +1 correlation would mean that all nurturant people are in people-oriented jobs. However, this is not the case in real life. It is important to note here that a negative correlation does not mean a weaker correlation than a positive one. It simply reflects a difference in the direction of the relationship between the variables. In psychological researchers, we cannot perfectly predict one variable from another, and thus perfect correlation may not exist here. Table 1.1 Types of correlation. Positive correlation. Both variables change in the same direction. As height increases, weight also increases. Negative correlation. Variables change in the opposite direction. As time of social media increases, time spent studying decreases. Zero correlation. There is no relationship between the variables. Tea consumption is not correlated with intelligence. Correlation studies are conducted by making observations, conducting surveys, or even using archival researches. Naturalistic observation method involves observing and recording variables of interest without any interference or manipulation in a natural setting. Keith, 2018. One major issue could be that the awareness of being observed may change participants' behavior. Survey method. It involves collecting information through a questionnaire, can be online or offline, to gain information into a particular topic of interest. It is the fastest, easiest, and cheapest option to gather large amount of data in a short span of time. Archival research. Some researches are done by analyzing studies that were conducted long ago by other researchers, or reviewing historical records and case studies. Keith, 2018. One of the major limitations it involves is having no control over data collection at all. Irrespective of the method used, observation or survey, it is important to ensure how the participants are chosen for a particular study. The participants must be representative of the population for whom generalizations, on the basis of the findings, would be made. As discussed in the section on the experimental method, to ensure a representative sample, the researcher should use random sampling. Each member of the population has an equal chance of being selected as a participant in the study. Now, sampling using this technique is not an easy task. Let us say of our population, on whom generalizations are to be made, involves 100 million people, and then selecting a sample that is random in nature, representative, is an enormous task. For instance, if we have to take a sample of 500 people from this, we may take up a phone directory, get a computer-generated list of random numbers and select on that basis, but it would still exclude people who do not have a phone. Therefore, we should generalize our findings only to the population from which we sampled. For instance, research conducted on African American women might not be true or valid, or some other ethnic group, race, or culture. Although random selection is important for the validity of correlational research, it is difficult to achieve it and thus is rarely employed. Table 1.2 Correlational research versus experimental research. Look at the screen. 1.2.4 Cross-sectional and longitudinal design. When data is collected as a whole to study a particular population at a single point in time to examine the relationship between the variables, it is called as a cross-sectional design. It can also be used to compare different samples at a given time, for instance, understanding the relationship between jogging and level of cholesterol. Here, the researcher can take 2 or 3 groups of joggers, depending upon age, gender, etc., and compare it to the non-joggers in the same category. Let us say the researcher took 2 groups depending on the age, 20 to 30 years, 30 to 40 years, and further bifurcated these 2 groups between males and females and compared their cholesterol levels to the non-joggers in the same age categories. Now, here the researcher can create subsets on the basis of gender, income, etc., but cannot consider past cholesterol levels. This method can describe the characteristics that exist in a population, but cannot determine the cause and effect relationship between variables. We can make inferences about possible relationships, as is the case in the example here, but cannot be sure of a definitive cause and effect relationship. Thus, a cross-sectional study offers us a snapshot of a single moment in time and does not consider what happens before or after it. Preliminary data gathered from here can also be used further to support research or experimentation. Longitudinal study is the one in which data is gathered from the same sample repeatedly over an extended period of time. Therefore, depending on the kind of information required, it may last from a year or few years to even decades. It extends beyond a specific point or a single frame of time, which helps in understanding and establishing a proper sequence of events occurred. For instance, if the researcher wishes to measure the change in cholesterol levels in women who have jogged for 5 years continuously, will account for a longitudinal study. This would be more likely to suggest a cause and effect relationship but does not ensure it. It is important to remember that the research and the research questions should drive the design. For instance, if we try to find if employment is associated with better health, then a cross-sectional study involving a survey at one point of time may tell us the relationship between the two variables. However, it does not tell us if employment leads to better health or if better health gives an indication of higher employment rates. If we use a longitudinal design here, it may help us in measuring both employment and health at one time and then again do so after a gap of 6 months or so, along with establishing a likely cause and effect relationship. Longitudinal studies also help in distinguishing age effects from cohort effects. Age effects are individual-specific, often biological sources of change, whereas a cohort can be thought of as a social context affecting individuals that reside within them. The cohort effect is the effect due to an individual being born in a certain time, region, period, or having experienced similar life experiences, as they are born in similar time periods. In a cross-sectional design, it is difficult to separate age effect from cohort effects. For instance, if a study attempts to measure the impact of age on learning computers and finds that the older adults have a significantly decreased ability to learn computers, such that the 45-year-olds score lower than 35-year-olds, who score lower than 25-year-olds. Here it seems that age has a role to play, but the difference could also be due to a cohort effect. The older participants had significantly low exposure to computers while growing up, in comparison to the younger participants in the group. Table 1.3 Cross-sectional versus longitudinal design. Conducted at a given point in time, requires researcher to revisit participants at proper intervals over a period of time. Conducted with different samples, conducted with the same sample over the years. Cannot determine cause and effect relationship, can justify cause and effect relationship. Multiple variables can be studied at a single point in time. Only one variable is considered to conduct the study. Saves time, time-consuming, may take years or decades, saves money, tends to be expensive. 1.2.5 Meta-analysis. Meta-analysis means a study about studies. Sometimes researchers want to know answers to questions that have been studied a lot previously, so they conduct a meta-analysis, pooling data from multiple studies systematically previously published studies on the topic, analyze it and produce an integrated result. Such results help in finding a general trend across the studies. A meta-analysis synthesizes results from all the published studies on the same topic as if someone has done a single study with a larger sample size. Meta-analysis can average across different studies, producing an overall effect which can be judged in terms of its significance and magnitude as well. Sex comparison has always been of interest to the researchers, yet an extremely controversial area. Researchers continue to debate if sex-based comparisons should be made or not. A vast literature exists on this topic in both cognitive and social domain and also in various other areas. Meta-analysis has been used to these studies to help researchers integrate these findings. It would be important to note here that a biased meta-analysis can produce misleading results. The bias may exist at the level of search. For instance, An incomplete set of keywords or the search engine in itself could unintentionally produce some bias. At a selection level, if the researchers are not clear about the criteria to choose from a long list of potential studies, it may produce biased results. Thus, one needs to exercise precaution while conducting a meta-analysis. 1.3 Difficulties in conducting gender research. Very much like any other field, the study of gender also has its unique set of difficulties and challenges. At each stage of the research process, the researcher may end up influencing the outcome intentionally or unintentionally. Biases may occur in the way the study is designed, when the questions are being asked, the manner in which data is collected, the way in which data is interpreted or communicated in the form of results. Participants can also be a source of bias, especially if they try to be a certain way to give desired results to the researcher or if they wish to present themselves in a certain way. In this section, let's try and understand some of these probable issues. 1.3.1 Experimenter effect. Experimenter effect refers to the ways in which the experimenter or the researcher can influence the results of the study that is being conducted. For instance, certain studies have demonstrated that the sex of the researcher or investigator can influence the results of the study. Arundel, 1997, observed how the male participants in her study responded to her not as a researcher but to their expectation of her as a woman by disclosing personal and emotional details of their life. Experimenter effect can exist at many stages of the research. Let's pay attention to some of these issues. Most of the researchers are highly interested in the phenomenon they study and also have certain expectations about the results of their work. In an area such as gender, most of us, researchers, have certain beliefs and values which guide our work. This may not be intentional in nature, but the researcher cannot be completely value-free. Expectations and hypotheses based on a theory are acceptable here, but hunches on the basis of our personal expectations and desires might seem problematic and may lead to biased results. Participants, as selected by the experimenter, can also influence a study's outcome. For instance, when researchers limit their studies to all males or just females, it gets difficult to generalize the findings on the other sex. Sometimes we compare findings to understand the difference between two groups, let's say males and females. The researcher here should be sensitive to other variables that may distinguish the groups and can impact the findings, such as if one group is employed and another one is not employed, it may have an impact on the variables being studied. While generalizing across the studies, researchers should ensure that the different ways in which the dependent variable is measured do not influence the findings. For instance, dependent variables can be biased in favor of either males or females. If a study compares helping behavior of men and women towards strangers by measuring how many of the participants assist the stranger in changing a flat tire of the car, there is a higher probability of men helping out more than women due to the fact that they have more experience with such a situation than women. Thus, social roles and experience also play a role here. It is unlikely that there is a biological reason behind men choosing this role more than women. The manner in which data is collected can also be a factor in influencing the results of the study. In a classic study, Rosenthal, 1967, found that male and female experimenters smiled more and glanced more at same-sex participants than the opposite sex while giving the instructions. This could influence the participants and their expectations, which would ultimately impact the final results. Certain beliefs of the researcher may also be a reason for his/her behavior, although unintentional, which could influence the participants to respond in a certain way, confirming the beliefs of the researcher. The manner in which results are communicated could be another source of bias. Sometimes, due to our bias towards a particular group, we may interpret and conclude in a certain way, favoring one over the other. Another issue is that sex differences are more interesting than sex similarities, and thus studies of differences are more likely to be published. Susan Faludi, 1999, highlighted this in the book, Backlash, The Undeclared War Against American Women. She emphasized that how the results if the studies which support the prevalent culture are more likely to be published. 1.3.2 Participant effect. Participants who are a part of the study can also influence the outcome of a study. These are called as demand characteristics. Some of these are discussed below. Social desirability response bias. People wish to behave in socially desirable ways. It makes them likable and normal. With regard to gender studies, essentialist notions have a prescribed set for being masculine and feminine. On self-report measures, people may end up rating themselves in accordance to their prescribed gender roles and norms in order to fit in the society, especially if they realize the purpose of the research. Nevertheless, this would not be the true picture of how they are and thus influencing the results. For instance, it is socially desirable for a man to say they are aggressive and less masculine even if they are not so in reality. A study by Fisher, 2007, showed that college men reported having more sexual partners when the researcher in front of them was a female than a male. Ensuring confidentiality, disguising the nature of research, and observing behavior rather than taking a self-report measure may minimize the effects of demand characteristics. In a lab setting, a lot of emphasis is paid on controlling the external conditions so that only form is manipulated to see the effects on DV. We have already discussed that this artificiality is a threat to external validity. But another point to be noted here is that in laboratory men and women may get equal treatment and similar conditions, but that is not the case in the real world. Variables confounded with sex of the participant is usually a subject variable rather than a true independent variable that is manipulated. For instance, when we are comparing emotions or feelings in men and women, we can never be certain if the difference found is due to sex alone or values and experiences of being men or women have a role to play in it. Thus, the question that remains is that when we observe a sex difference, is it because of the biological binary distinction of male and female, or is it due to the psychological category of gender? Box 1.2 Some key historical quantitative researches in the area of gender and sexuality. Before the studies described under this section, there was scant quantitative work to draw upon, especially in the area of gender and sexuality. The Kinsey studies are considered as the largest studies of sexual behavior, and also demonstrated the spread of same-sex behavior in the population. Gathorn-Hardy, 2005. Rather than sexual orientation identity, Kinsey talked about experience or response. The Masters and Johnson studies. In late 1950s, Masters and Johnson conducted a series of studies into sexual functioning and performance. They also considered the relationship between sexuality and aging. This research had an important role to play in establishing sexuality as an important aspect of quality of life. The Klein Sexual Orientation Grid. This grid differentiates between attraction, behavior, fantasies, emotional preferences and other variables, which are social in nature, lifestyle, and self-identification. Klein, 1993. The BEM Sex Role Inventory, BSRI, it's a self-report questionnaire used to measure masculine and feminine traits on different dimensions, BEM. 1974. But, over the years, researchers have argued that BSRI measures traditional sex role characteristics as defined in the context of the original sample norms, on which the study was based. Hegarty, 2003. 1.4 Qualitative Inquiry. Qualitative research is an important tool to understand experiences of the individual and making meaning out of it. Thus, qualitative researchers are interested in how people make sense of the world and experience events. The focus is on the quality and texture of the experience, rather than the identification of a cause-effect relationship, as the researchers are interested in the meaning people attribute to events or conditions. They do not start with preconceived variables which would hinder in understanding participants' experience as they experience it themselves. Thus, the researcher tries not to impose one's meaning on the phenomenon under investigation. Here the objective is to describe and possibly explain experiences and events as they exist for the participants, but never to predict. Qualitative research has been broadly classified into two camps: experiential research and critical research. It is important to note here that the classification is not strict in any sense. Experiential research aims at documenting people's experiences, views, and practices about a particular phenomenon. Critical research, on the other hand, aims at understanding and interrogating dominant meanings and practices, unpackaging or deconstructing them. Clark et al., 2010. There are various ways of conducting qualitative research. Here we would be highlighting some of these methods. Some of the qualitative methods that are used are thematic analysis, Braun and Clark, 2006, grounded theory, Sharmas, 2006, interpretative phenomenological analysis, Smith et al., 2009, discourse analysis, Wiggins and Riley, 2010, and conversation analysis, Sidnell and Stivers, 2012. It is the research area and the research question which decides the kind of approach that would be suitable. Similarly, the choice of techniques to be used for data collection involves consideration regarding how to address the phenomena at hand. The data can be collected using semi-structured interviews to explore experiential, life history, or narrative types of areas, focus group interviews to explore perceptions, beliefs, attitudes, photo voice and photo elicitation, community-based participatory research to document and reflect upon reality, maintaining diary entries, etc. Data can also be collected from online support groups, media, such as newspapers, radio talks, televisions, magazines, etc., and videos available on YouTube. OTT platforms could also provide an insight into how certain issues are constructed. Observation, audio/video recording phenomena, such as classroom interactions, proceedings, counseling sessions, can also be some of the ways to collect data. Even before conducting any qualitative research, one needs to pay attention to the design of the study, especially to ensure that the researcher would be able to collect and eventually analyze data, enabling exploration in an open-ended manner. In the following section, let us understand the experiential and critical methods. But before that, let us pay attention to the issue of researcher membership in the group being studied. 1.4.1 Insider/outsider considerations in qualitative research. The issue regarding membership of the researcher in the group that is being studied is of relevance to all the approaches involving qualitative methodology. The researcher has a crucial role in data collection and analysis, thus, it matters if the researcher is an insider or an outsider. As an insider, the researcher may share the characteristic, role, and experience of the participants under the study, and as an outsider, the researcher may not share the commonality with the participants. Therefore, the membership status vis-à-vis those who are participating in the research is an essential aspect of the investigation and research process. For all purposes, an insider researcher enhances the depth and breadth of understanding a population as the researcher shares the identity, language, or some experiential base with the participant, but it also raises questions regarding objectivity, reflexivity, and authenticity. IGNOU, 2000. One may feel such research would lack critical depth as the researcher is too close to the topic and may be quite similar to those being studied. However, when one is representing the voices of others, outsider research, there is a risk of pathologizing the other. Wilkinson and Kitzinger, 1996. Perhaps that is why certain recent studies concerning LGBTQ issues have stated the insider advantage in studying sexuality and related areas. Clark et al., 2010. Although emphasis on objective data has been replaced with the benefits that subjective aspects could provide in the research process, being an insider comes with a set of challenges. The researchers may face a role conflict and may find it difficult to navigate between loyalty, tugs, behavioral claims and presenting the perception about the issue as is. Brannigan Coughlin, 2007. Aslin, 2003, argued that role confusion may occur in any study, but researchers' familiarity with the setting or participants due to their membership in the group increases the risk. Although being an insider has advantages, especially the fact that one's membership automatically provides a certain degree of trust and openness in the participants, there are areas and topics which the researcher might be interested in studying but may not have any personal experience with it. For instance, someone trying to understand patterns of grief but has not lost any dear one. Thus, in order to overcome this, guidelines for good practices can be followed. Wheeler, 2003. It may include familiarizing oneself with the issues around the participant and their context, outlining the motivations behind the study in detail, specifying how the findings would be used, and consulting others or people with similar experiences while designing the research. This is not an exhaustive list, and one must take careful steps and considerations while conducting research as an insider or outsider, especially with topics that are sensitive in nature, to yield meaningful results. 1.4.2 Experiential research. Experiential research is about giving voice to and validating the experiences and practices of the participants. Braun and Clark, 2013. It is about valuing and prioritizing participants' interpretations of their life world. Various researchers, such as Smith and colleagues, 2009, consider this to be an ideal approach to study areas involving gender and sexuality, especially to make sense of an individual's life from his/her frame of reference. Interpretative phenomenological analysis, IPA, is one such approach which is led by Jonathan Smith. It uses the theoretical traditions of phenomenology and hermeneutics. Shaw, 2010. It encourages the participants to reflect on and interpret their experiences. The analysis is grounded in the individual level and the researcher builds up over it, case by case. Shaw, 2010. Thus, IPA is used with smaller and relatively homogeneous sample wherein the experience is understood in great details. One of the illustrations has been provided by O'Mullen and colleagues, 2017, who explored women's sexual experiences and difficulties and how do they locate these experiences within the cultural and social contexts. Although it has been argued that it is possible to move to more general claims with IPA, but this should only be after the potential of the case has been realized. Smith et al., 2009, p.3. But more than generalizations, evaluation in IPA or qualitative research in general depends on the degree to which the findings work with the participant's perspective. Glaser and Strauss, 1967. It focuses on credibility, how well the researcher's portrayal of the participants match their perceptions. Dependability rests on the quality of data collection and analysis, and transferability, degree to which the study has made it possible for the audience to apply findings in situation investigated to other similar situations. 1.4.3 Between experiential and critical research. Here we would discuss another approach called as narrative analysis that utilizes various interdisciplinary perspectives, ranging from experiential to critical. Mishler, 1990, has suggested that humans perform identity through generation of narratives in which they express and display who they are and or what would they want to be. Thus, we continuously use narratives to make sense of ourselves and others around us, along with various events that are happening. There are various ways to conduct a narrative analysis, but broadly speaking it contains 6 elements. Above, 1982, an abstract, a section discussing the contextual details of the story, a complicating action, an evaluation, a resolution, and a coda, relevance of the story as pointed by the narrator by connecting it with everyday life. This model has been criticized for not highlighting the relationship between the teller and the recipient. Riesman, 1993. There are others who have argued for a more critical stance. For example, Lind, 1993, discussed that the analysis of narratives should begin from the level of individual construction of sentences to the social level of belief system. Thus, there is a social negotiation of narratives that is being hinted at here, and finally the effect of this negotiation on the construction of narratives. Individual narratives contain social, cultural, historical norms and moral standards of that particular time frame. It has been believed that we keep revising our life story to make it coherent, as we wish to display an identity in the society that is good, stable, and the one that follows the norm. The study of gender and narrative also tries to explore the ways in which constructs such as sex, gender, and sexuality may shape narrative texts and theories through which readers approach them. It would be interesting to note here that the field known as feminist narratology explores implications of sex, gender, and/or sexuality to understand the nature, form, and functioning of narrative. Prince. 1987-2003, p. 65. 1.4.4 Critical research. Critical research aims at addressing societal structures and institutions which are oppressive in nature so that transformative action can be taken eventually. To reduce the power gap and hierarchy, critical analysis looks at language as a social practice and takes the historical and socio-political context of the text into serious consideration. Discursive approaches position language as an active agent or action, where the primary focus is on understanding how a phenomenon is constructed and displayed in social interactions. Most experiential approaches view language as a transparent medium to relay pre-existing knowledge, but discourse analysis views it as a site where we constitute knowledge. Discourse analysis is an approach that investigates how everyday texts create and reinforce social inequalities and hierarchies, thus challenging these power structures and offering an alternative perspective to social reality. Discursive approaches take a social constructionist stance and view identity as flexible, relational, contextual, situated and inflected by the existing power relations. Gergen, 1999. Although discursive approaches are informed by different theoretical positions and methodological practices, the key focus is discourse in the form of talk and/or text, with emphasis on how the discourse is oriented and how representations are constructed. Potter and Wiggins, 2007. An interesting work that can be used as an example to illustrate the given points is about the issue of sexual consent and rape. O'Byrne and colleagues, 2006, discuss the findings of miscommunication model, which claimed that a dichotomy exists between how men and women carry conversations, that is, they do not understand each other fully. The model has been widely used to understand opine about issues such as rape. It concluded that women should say a clear no to unwanted sexual advances towards them. Kitzinger and Frith, 1999, built an argument using conversation analytic studies stating that we do not just say no and refusals are put across in softer ways, like turning down an offer with some excuse, while exploring. Both Kitzinger and Frith, 1999, and O'Byrne and colleagues, 2008, used focus group interviews but with women and men respectively to make sense of this issue. They realized that men do understand the normative ways wherein both verbal and non-verbal refusals are made. Thus, they critiqued the understanding that a clear no should be verbalized to effectively refuse sex and appeals on the ground of misunderstanding of sexual refusals in rape cases should be dealt with care and precaution. 1.5 Concluding remarks. By now we have understood that the psychology of gender comprises of a vast and rich array of topics that are pursued for research. They draw on latest theories and sophisticated methodologies which would be discussed in the subsequent units as well. It has expanded to include both biological and sociological processes. The growth has been such that psychologists across various disciplines have started incorporating gender-related issues in their research, and gender psychologists are also bringing other theories and methods to answer gender questions. Initially, the study of psychology of gender was considered as quite political in nature, but with time, growth and expansion in the area, it has entered the scientific mainstream as well. The terminology used and the word choice has a role to play in understanding the tacit belief system, and most importantly, gender processes operate in conjunction with other social categories such as age, race, class, etc. Thus, more attention should be paid to these group interactions as well. 1.6 Summary. To sum up what we have learnt in this unit, here is a quick recap. Initial research in the area of gender emphasized establishing that men were intelligent than women by examining their brain size. Initially, the concept of masculinity/femininity was defined mainly by sex differences, and homosexuality was thought to be equivalent to femininity. The period between 1954 and 1982 delved in the conceptualization and measurement of gender roles and gender-related traits. BSRI and PAC were different from previous instruments as they established masculinity and femininity as two independent dimensions rather than two opposite ends of a single continuum. Random assignment is an important feature of experimental method as it helps in isolating the independent variable as true cause and effect. Experiments are often high in internal validity and correlational method is high in external validity. Meta-analysis is a systematic statistical tool developed to summarize the results of a large number of studies in a particular area. The experimenter can influence a study and its outcome in various ways, such as how it has been designed, how data is collected, analyzed or interpreted, and even by the way it is reported. Differences between men and women are less likely to be visible in a laboratory setting than in real life, as they face similar conditions in a laboratory setting, but that is not case in real life. Experiential qualitative research gives importance to participants' descriptions of their lived experience while giving voice to their lives and practices. Critical approaches pay attention to the issues such as how gender and sexuality-based phenomena, practices are constructed in a wider discourse. One of the issues in the area of qualitative research involves if the researcher should be an insider or an outsider, or both, in relation to the group that is being studied. Thank you. Subscribe to our channel for more updates, and we will see you with the next chapter.